where the lilies wait in silence, a journey through rain, regret, and the ghosts of love that linger in the corners of an abandoned home. The rain had returned after a long drought, falling in soft, deliberate strokes across the village roofs. It came without warning, brushing through the trees like a sigh, gentle enough to be mistaken for silence. Mist drifted along the ridges of the hills, dissolving into the mountains beyond, and the scent of damp soil rose from the ground as though the earth itself was exhaling. He arrived just before dawn, coat heavy with moisture, suitcase wheels trailing in the mud. The bus had dropped him off at the foot of the hill, leaving behind only silence and the retreating growl of its engine. The road leading up was narrower than he remembered, framed by moss-covered stones and a thicket of ferns that had crept into the cracks over time. The fig tree still stood at the bend, leaning forward as if straining to see who would come next. The house stood in silence at the top, half hidden behind ivy and age. Its wooden frame had darkened with the passing years, its porch sagging slightly under the weight of rain and forgotten summers. The windows were fogged from within, and the iron gate, once painted white, had long surrendered to rust. But even in its disrepair, the house still held a kind of quiet grace, like an old letter tucked away in a drawer, forgotten but never discarded. He stood at the gate, fingers resting on its cool surface, unsure whether the feeling rising in his chest was guilt or something softer. The house had been hers in every way. She had cared for it with hands that never asked for help, filling it with warmth he had never learned to return. When he finally stepped through the gate, the gravel crunched beneath his shoes in a rhythm that stirred old echoes. The lilies by the fence had overgrown, pale petals drooping under the weight of the rain. She had planted them there years ago, saying they were her favorite, not because they were beautiful, but because they always came back, no matter how harsh the winter. The door groaned as it opened, releasing a faint scent of old wood and closed memories. Inside, the air was thick with stillness. White sheets covered the furniture like forgotten ghosts. Dust floated in the sunlight that filtered through the half-open blinds. The house had not been lived in for years, yet it did not feel abandoned, only paused, waiting for time to resume. He walked through the rooms slowly. The living room still bore the outline of their former life, the indentations in the couch, the stain on the rug from a long-ago spill, and the photograph frames turned slightly askew on the mantel. Upstairs, the bedroom window was left ajar. The curtains stirred faintly in the breeze, like fingers reaching for something just beyond grasp. He did not rush to clean. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet wrap around him. The suitcase remained unopened. The floor creaked beneath his weight. Somewhere downstairs, a clock ticked without hurry. That evening, he opened the windows wide. The rain had stopped, and the breeze brought in the scent of lilies and wet leaves. From the veranda, the garden spread out like a forgotten dream, overgrown, wild, but still shaped by the hands that once nurtured it. The stone path was cracked, the hedges uneven, yet the memory of her lingered in every corner. She had once knelt there daily, tending to each plant with the quiet focus of someone who had made peace with silence. The piano in the corner of the living room sat untouched, its cover yellowed with age. He lifted the cloth and pressed one of the keys. The note rang out thin and hollow, as though surprised to be heard. She used to play every evening, soft, steady notes that floated through the house like smoke, melodies that said everything she never spoke aloud. In the hallway cabinet, he found a small notebook bound in linen. Her handwriting filled its pages, entries written in the margins of days, reflecting thoughts too delicate to voice aloud. She had written about the lilies, about the rain, and about the long hours she spent alone, waiting for something unnamed. He read each entry slowly, as if the words might vanish if his eyes moved too quickly. The final page had only one sentence. "The lilies are late this year. Maybe they're waiting for him, too." He closed the book and sat for a long time in the dark. Sleep did not come easily. The wind moved through the house with a sound like distant weeping. The candle he lit on the kitchen table flickered uncertainly. He poured himself tea from the old kettle, though it tasted of rust and disuse. Across the table, he imagined her sitting where she always had, eyes lowered, fingers tracing the rim of her mug, surrounded by the faint scent of soap and soil. He wondered how many evenings she had spent this way, alone in the quiet, with nothing but the sound of rain against the roof and the echo of a life that had slowly slipped away. In the attic, beneath a layer of dust, he found a box of photographs, snapshots from years when the house was still full of laughter and light. Her smile appeared in nearly all of them, never broad, but soft and unguarded. In one, she knelt by the garden, hands in the dirt, her hair caught by the wind. In another, they stood side by side on the veranda, arms barely touching, both looking somewhere beyond the camera. The years had blurred the edges of those memories, but now they returned in vivid color. He remembered the way she would hum to herself while folding laundry and the way she always paused at the door before leaving, as though unsure whether to go or wait a moment longer. He had taken those things for granted, never imagining they would one day be all that remained. He spent the following days restoring what he could, not to reclaim the past, but to honor it. He patched the veranda roof, oiled the hinges, and swept away cobwebs that had formed like veils in the corners of each room. In the garden, he pulled weeds with hands unused to labor, careful not to disturb the lilies. They had begun to open now, trembling in the morning light. The village remained quiet. Occasionally, neighbors passed by, offering curious glances or silent nods. Some recognized him, others had only heard of him, the one who left, the one who never came back. He did not explain. Words felt unnecessary here. What he sought could not be named or defended. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer in her study, he found a bundle of letters. His letters, sent from distant cities, written in rushed handwriting on hotel stationery or coffee-stained paper. She had kept them all. None were returned, even though his words had grown colder over the years, the tone shifting from affection to obligation. Still, she had tucked them away neatly, as if believing that love, even diluted, was worth preserving. Guilt pressed into his chest like a weight. He thought of the unanswered phone calls, the birthdays missed, and the empty promises buried beneath ambition. He had told himself for years that he was doing it for them, for a better life, for security. But in chasing a future he could never quite reach, he had left behind the only thing that had asked nothing of him but presence. The lilies bloomed fully by the start of June. Their scent filled the house in the early morning, subtle and bittersweet. He began each day by sitting beside them, notebook in hand, rereading her final thoughts. The ache of her absence had softened, but it remained, threaded through every corner of the home, like light caught between curtains. Then one day, beneath the fig tree, he found a small wooden box wrapped in faded cloth. It had been tucked behind a cluster of stones, protected from the rain. Inside was a single black and white photograph. Her as a child, standing barefoot in the garden, hand outstretched toward the camera, eyes full of wonder. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a note written in her unmistakable handwriting. Some memories are meant to stay buried in the soil, like seeds waiting for the right season. If you found this, then maybe that season has come. The paper trembled in his hands, though the wind had stilled. He did not fully understand what she meant, but he felt it, an understanding that had nothing to do with logic, a truth buried deep beneath years of silence and distance, finally blooming in its own time. He stood there beneath the fig tree as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, light spilling across the garden like something sacred. The lilies swayed softly in the breeze, and for the first time in a very long while, he let the stillness fill him completely, not as an emptiness, but as a space where grief could breathe. Somewhere in the distance, the wind shifted again. The chime beneath the eaves stirred faintly, releasing a single note that hung in the air just long enough to be remembered. He closed his eyes and listened. Summer deepened as days unfolded quietly over the house. Mornings arrived with soft gold slipping between the blinds, and evenings fell in long sighs, the skies flushed with fading light. The garden had begun to respond to his care, not perfectly, but enough to show signs of resilience. Moss receded where the path had been swept. A few birds returned to the branches above the porch. The silence that had once pressed against the walls now moved more like memory than grief, present but softened. He spent hours tending the lilies. Their petals, pale as moonlight, had opened wide, full and fragrant, their brief lives spent blooming against the passing wind. They had become her voice now, the way they swayed, the way their scent lingered on his clothes, the way they returned even after the coldest seasons. He spoke to them without words, asking questions he never could when she was alive, hoping they might carry the weight of his unspoken apologies. The village had begun to notice his return more openly. A few left small bundles at the gate, vegetables, dried herbs, and sweet rice wrapped in paper. No one stayed to speak, but their gestures said enough. They remembered her. They remembered the quiet woman who had stayed when he left, who greeted them with soft eyes and hands that offered warmth even when her own days grew colder. One morning, he ventured into the village for the first time since his return. The streets had changed little. The old bell tower still marked the hours with its solemn chime. The small shop where she used to buy her tea now stood shuttered, though the scent of roasted barley still drifted faintly from a neighboring home. Children ran barefoot along the road, the same way they had in his youth, though none of their faces were familiar. He visited the old bridge where they once sat after storms. watching the river swell with rainwater. The stones were worn smooth now, and moss grew along the edges, but the current still whispered the same song. He stood there for a long time, remembering how she used to trace patterns in the dust with her fingers, eyes always watching the sky, as if waiting for something the earth could never give her. When he returned to the house that evening, the sky was already dimming. He stood at the threshold, watching the shadows lengthen across the porch. The scent of lilies hung thick in the air. Somewhere inside, the chime rang faintly. He thought of how often she must have listened to that sound alone, how it had marked the passage of time for her in his absence. He began to write, not letters, not entries, but small reflections, fragments of memory, confessions buried too long, truths he had once denied himself. He wrote of the day he first left, of how she had waited by the gate long after his figure disappeared down the hill. He wrote of the years he spent chasing ambitions that were never satisfied, of the silence that grew between their occasional calls, and of the guilt that pooled in his chest each time he hung up. Each night, he added more to the pile on the desk, folding the pages carefully and placing them in the wooden box beneath the window. The lilies began to wither by the third week of July. Their petals, once open and radiant, curled inward, edges browned by sun and time. He did not remove them. He let them remain where they were, bowing gently under their own weight. Even in decay, they held a kind of grace, a final offering before their return to the soil. He walked the house slowly each day, no longer searching for remnants, but acknowledging them. A chipped mug was left on the kitchen shelf. A scarf still draped across the stair railing, the indentation in the pillow on her side of the bed. He had not erased her presence. He had simply made space for it again, not as a wound, but as part of the home's breath. The village priest sent word that her ashes had been kept safely at the temple all these years. She had never requested a burial. No ceremony had been held. She had left no will, just silence and a house left as it was. He visited the temple on a clouded afternoon. The path was lined with pine trees, their needles falling in soft, rust-colored drifts. The urn was plain, unmarked, and placed near the altar where candles burned low. The monk who handed it to him said nothing, only bowed once before returning to his seat. He held it gently, his hands trembling slightly, not from the weight but from the sudden nearness of her. It was the first time he had touched something of hers since her death. The sensation struck like wind across still water. Back at the house, he placed the urn in the garden beneath the fig tree. He sat there for hours, watching the way the branches shifted against the sky, the way light filtered through the canopy in dappled motion. He did not weep. The grief had already spent itself in quieter ways. This was something else, a release, an offering. He whispered thanks into the breeze, unsure if the words would reach her, but needing to say them all the same. The rain returned at the end of July, heavier than before. It fell in sheets across the hills, turning the paths to rivers, filling the air with the scent of wet bark and broken petals. The garden bent under the storm, lilies dissolving into the soil, their time done. He watched from the porch, unmoving, as the water swept away the season's end. And when the rain stopped, a strange stillness followed. In the days that passed, he prepared the garden for the next bloom. He trimmed what was overgrown, cleared the paths, and tilled the soil with careful hands. He did not rush. Each movement was deliberate, each gesture part of a rhythm he had only now come to understand. Life was not about preservation. It was about returning. By the time August came, the house no longer felt haunted. Not by ghosts, but by memory. Not a presence to fear, but a presence that watched gently, like twilight at the end of a warm day. He kept the windows open now. He left the door ajar in the evenings, and when the breeze passed through, he let it move as it pleased. One night, as the cicadas began to fade and the first signs of the season's turn stirred in the wind, he stood in the center of the garden and lit a single candle. He placed it beneath the fig tree, beside the urn, and stepped back. Above him, the stars emerged slowly, quiet and distant. He looked up, eyes following their slow procession, and thought of her once more. Not as the woman who had waited, but as someone who had already understood that love was not about holding on, but about letting someone go and hoping they found their way back when it mattered most. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not believe it could be given now. But he offered what he had, time, presence, and the promise to remain, not to undo the past, but to honor it. The next morning, he rose early, stepped barefoot into the garden, and began planting a new row of lilies. Not to replace the ones that had died, but to continue what she had started. And when the first chill of autumn finally brushed across his skin, he did not turn away. He closed his eyes, breathed in deeply, and stood still, rooted, like the house, like the fig tree, like the love that had waited all this time